Let's get started. So we're very happy to have Emma Pierson giving the talk today on how to expand your research profile. Emma is an assistant professor of computer science, the Jacobs Technion Cornell Institute at Cornell Tech and the Technion, and a computer science field member at Cornell University with a secondary joint appointment as an assistant professor of population health sciences at Weill Cornell Medical College. Emma develops data science and machine learning methods to study two broad areas, inequality and healthcare. And Emma's work has been recognized by numerous awards, Best Paper Awards at KDD and AI Stats, an NSF Career Award, a Rhodes Scholarship, Fellowship, Rising Star in EECS, MIT Technology Review, 35 Innovators Under 35, and Forbes 30 Under 30 in Science. Okay, so Emma, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I made some slides. There are a lot of questions. I'm going to try and go through the slides relatively quickly and then get to the questions. My guess is the slides are about 30 to 40 minutes of content. And to give an outline of what I'm going to talk about, I'll give a little bit of context about sort of how I got here, which I think will usefully inform how I think about research questions. And then the rest of the talk addresses two main questions. The first is sort of people tips, like how do you find and work with collaborators, including with yourself? And the other is about research tips and generating research ideas. And a lot of the questions seem to pertain to the latter, and as such, maybe I'll focus a bit on that. So to give some context sort of for how I got here, as mentioned, sort of I broadly work on two areas, sort of inequality and healthcare. That includes stuff like using machine learning to study inequality in pain or policing or COVID-19. So, generally sort of socially relevant and depressing topics, and then, applications of big data and methods therein. And sort of my path to this point, I've always sort of liked math and physics and other nerdy stuff since I was a little kid. This is me dressing up as a chessboard for Halloween, so you can tell I've always been very cool and had a lot of friends. And when I came into Stanford, I came in as a physics major. I didn't actually know any computer science. But in my second year at Stanford, I decided I should try computer science. And so I enrolled in my first computer science class, which was AI. And that summer, I started doing computer science research in a physics lab, developing algorithms to identify certain types of galaxies. But I realized something that was missing, that sort of AI was amazing, but I wanted to use it to study things that were closer to home. I didn't want to be studying galaxies light years away. And this was really driven home for me a few months later when I received a genetic test telling me I carried a mutation that gave me a very high risk of developing cancer, which is called a BRCA mutation. Some of you might have heard of it. And this was, pretty bad news to receive as a 20-year-old, and I spent the next few months being pretty upset about it. And during this period, when I was trying to come to terms with the news, I came across this paper out of Daphne Kohler's lab. She was an AI professor at Stanford at the time. These days, she's in industry. And in her paper, they take images of cells from cancer patients and apply a computer vision model to predict whether the patients will survive. These days, you would probably do all that using deep learning. Back then, they were using sort of old school computer vision. And I thought it was the most amazing thing. And more importantly, it gave me hope. I thought, I had this cancer problem. I would work on it with AI. I knew I wasn't going to cure cancer, but I thought working on it and learning about it would make me feel better. Understanding the things that frighten you often does. So I wrote to Daphne, and she wrote back on New Year's Day, and she offered me a spot doing research in her lab, and I took it. And there's a lesson I take from this difficult period in my life, which is that crying is underrated. I've found those, sort of tough times like that one to be very useful in crystallizing what matters to you. And from that point on, I became much more intensely focused on what I wanted to do in my life. And when I graduated Stanford in 2013 with a bachelor's in physics and a master's in CS, I decided to take a job at 23andMe, which is a genetics company which offers very cheap testing for the BRCA mutation, which I carried. And the test was so cheap that my little sister, still a teenager, could afford to get tested. And I thought that was pretty amazing, so I accepted a job there. But a few months after I arrived at 23andMe, the US government sent a letter to the company ordering them to stop selling their health-related tests entirely because they hadn't jumped through the proper regulation. So they could no longer even sell their BRCA tests, which was the whole reason I had gone to the company in the first place. And so for the entire year I was there, I couldn't do any research on the topic I had intended to research, which I think is another important lesson about research. Like, even if you start out on a path like very well considered, it's very easy to get derailed. It's very hard to predict what projects will actually pan out and how they'll pan out. So then I went back to school to start PhD. I was still very motivated to do cancer research. And over the next couple of years, I wrote a half dozen papers developing AI methods for computational biology questions related to cancer. But I began to feel again that my work was unsatisfying because I was still too far away from real people's lives. Early in my graduate research, my grandpa, who carried the same genetic mutation that I do, died of brain cancer. And we were very close. That's us playing chess up there when I was little. And I wrote a fair bit of my master's thesis next to his hospital bed. The thesis develops new dimensionality reduction methods, like sort of fancy PCA, for a certain type of biological data, which is important in cancer and many other settings. And work like that just felt decades away from helping people like my grandpa, which is not to say that no one should do it. We need people doing that kind of fundamental research, even if it doesn't touch real people's lives for a long time. But I began to feel once again that I needed something that was going to help people in the short term. So I started working on data sets where each row was not a cell or a gene, but a person. I kept working on healthcare problems, and I also started working more on inequality. And that took me forward to some of the problems that I mentioned at the beginning. And so to answer a question that was in the chat that is relevant to this, someone asked, like, how do you know when to change your research topic? I mean, I've done that, several times, sort of from, physics to computational biology, and then from sort of computational biology to more human questions. And it's always sort of been driven by sort of a deep feeling in my heart that, like, I was losing enthusiasm for what I was doing. And I'll talk about this a bit more later in the talk, but like, it was sort of this deep, not a short run feeling that, like, no, fundamentally, I wanted to be getting closer to people. It wasn't caused by frustration with a particular paper. The paper writing was going well. It was just like, this isn't quite the thing in the long run. Okay. Finding and working with collaborators. I'll probably go through this relatively quickly since most of the questions pertain to research. So I will in general emphasize that, like, probably everyone here is like, you're very smart, you're very technical, you're very whatever, you love math or whatever. But, I really want to emphasize that I think non-technical skills are really important, and they're increasingly important as you get more senior, writing, speaking, listening, managing. This is incredibly important. And even as a PhD student, the ability to sort of concisely and precisely explain what you did, whether you're in a paper or in a meeting or on the job market, is just like phenomenally important. So I would not, or, people like call them like soft skills almost pejoratively, but like they're incredibly important. In terms of sort of working with collaborators, the number one thing I wish I had done earlier was like ensuring that people I worked with were like nice. I think working with nice people is incredibly important. This is especially true if you're going to give them power over you. For example, as a PhD advisor or as a long-term collaborator. So for example, as a PhD student, like if you're considering working with someone, if you can politely and privately inquire with PhD students who've worked with them in the past, like, are they a good mentor? Are they a total psychopath? Will they be nice to you? Like, I think this is a good thing to do and will save you a lot of pain. I would also push back very strongly against the idea that, like, some people are just like, brilliant assholes, basically, that like they're so smart that you have to put up with them. This is not true. Like, genius is so cheap in academia. You walk down a college campus, you'll pass like 63 geniuses on the way to lunch, like literally. And so I just think the notion that like anyone is smart enough that like you have to put up with them, I think that's silly. If someone is sort of making you feel systematically bad about yourself, you should get away from them. The converse of this is that you should be nice yourself. And this is not just true because it will get you into heaven or whatever. It's not just a moral claim. It's also professionally beneficial to be nice to people. The reason for this is that you are inhabiting a very small world. Like, the number of people who are experts in whatever topic you intend to excel at is like quite small. And your career is going to be decades long. And so people are going to remember you and they're going to talk about you. The other reason this is true is that collaboration is generally positive sum, which is to say you don't lose as much by like adding an author to your paper as they gain. Generally sort of working with more people and being nice to people pays off more than it doesn't. I think the other thing to say is that, like, generally in my experience in PhD, like, you are not competing against the people in your lab. Like, they are not your competition. They're really the folks that like you should work with and go to help. I'll just give you an example of this. Early in my PhD, this guy Pengwei sent me a nice email about an essay I'd written saying that, like, I read your essay about cancer and I related to that. It was a nice essay. And then he added me as an author to one of his papers where we were sort of working together. He brought me into the project. And as a result of that collaboration, we've written like another like 5 or 6 papers together over the years. It's been an incredibly valuable collaboration, certainly for me, hopefully for him. I think doing that kind of thing is good. I'll give you another quick example of this. The person at the bottom, this is John Kleinberg. John Kleinberg is well known throughout the CS community, of course, because he is, a brilliant theorist and so forth. He is also well known, though, because he is an incredibly nice human being. And so, like, when I, tell people about John, it's not just like, oh, you should work with him because he's really smart. It's like, you should work with him because he's really nice. And at this point, basically, I follow the like John Kleinberg rule, which is that, like, if John Kleinberg wouldn't do it and can be so successful, like, you don't need to do it either. Like, you can be a nice person because John can be a nice person. That's the John Kleinberg rule. Okay, what does it mean to be nice academically? This means stuff like, it doesn't just mean like smiling to people. It means like, if you like someone's work, like, send them an email to let them know, like, going out of your way to make people feel like they have a right to be in the room, being mindful about like how much space you're taking up. When someone screw up, like, people inevitably are going to make incredibly dumb mistakes, in your opinion, that like cost you weeks of work. Like, be nice when this happens, be cautious on Twitter. Like, I generally think being snarky on Twitter is not a good idea. Being generous with credit, err on the side of making people co-authors if you're not sure. Always discuss co-authorship with people. Don't cut people out. Be humble about your own abilities and stuff like that. I think this also extends to being nice to yourself. I think, you can be miserable for a week and get work done. Maybe you can be miserable for a month, but it's very hard in the long term, I think, to be successful if you're miserable in academia. I think you will burn out. I think it is very hard to do brilliant and creative work. The times when I've had like really good ideas, they didn't tend to be like, oh my God, I'm so scared, I need to have a really good idea. Or you know what I'm saying? Like, it was like, I was at a bar drinking a cocktail and writing a little math or something like that. I was relaxed or whatever. And I think it's much easier to sort of do really good work in that state. And I think also, like, you only have 70 or 80 years on this planet. Like, you don't want to spend it being totally miserable staring at a computer screen. So I definitely think it's true that, like, sometimes research entails doing things that conflict with your short-term happiness. The NeurIPS deadline is coming up. You have 48 hours. You don't have a draft. You're going to lose some sleep. Fine. I don't think it should come at the expense of your long-term happiness. This is especially true given that, like, abundant research shows that PhD is hard and stressful. Research is difficult, lots of existential angst, people are difficult, interpersonal issues, all these things. PhD students are at the, sort of close to the bottom of an often very messed up academic power hierarchy. All of these things combine, I think, to produce high rates of depression and anxiety among PhD students. Tips for being happy, I think, pay attention to your feelings and sort of learning what you need to be happy and resilient. This is individual specific. So, for example, I hate having deadlines. Other people need having deadlines. I hate working down to the wire. I get things done early. Other people don't. Some people like to work in the middle of the night. Some people don't. Some people like Taylor Swift, and some people make a sad error about that question. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is, like, it's okay to have days and weeks where you're not productive. The key is not letting guilt about that lead to months where nothing gets done. That tip comes from my collaborator Nikhil, and I think it is good advice. Things I need to be happy include sort of social connections, writing, cats, etc. I also, I do work 7 days a week, but I try and keep myself happy while I work. So, like, if I'm gonna work on a Sunday, I'm gonna work in a beautiful place. This is a cafe in New York City. In terms of collaborators, your family and friends can also be your colleagues. This is Mohammed Akbarpour and Shengwu Li, Susan Athey and Guido Imbens, Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson. This guy is my uncle. I work with my sister a lot. I think working with people you genuinely like can be fun. My partner and I have co-authored a paper together, stuff like that. There are also potentially downsides to doing that if you correlate your work and non-work too much, but I think, in terms of people to work with, think, your family and friends can be fun to work with. I also try and cultivate like, sort of colleagues, like I call them like a brain trust. And this is generally like a group of people who like I respect and are smart and I like and are often better than me at, whatever in particular they do. So, to give an example of this, Shang Wu is an expert in market design and econ theory. I don't know really anything about either of these things, but it's definitely very useful to know that like if I need someone to tell me whether like a matching problem is like tractable, Shang Wu is like probably one of the best people in the world to do that. And I would say in general, sort of more generally, you want people who are better than you at things. You do not always want to be the smartest person in the room. And a lot of us sort of tie our identity to that idea a little bit, and I think to the extent that you can let go of that and just be happy to be in the room, you will be better at your work and you will be happier. These colleagues, this brain trust, do a lot of things which are very valuable for me. So I use them to filter ideas, and I'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. I rarely pursue anything, but without running it by a couple of people and being like, is this interesting? Would you read this paper? Do you care about this question? They edit my writing. Anything I tweet that is even remotely controversial probably went past a couple of these people. They give me professional advice, they give guest lectures in my class, and in general are able to sort of outsource a lot of my thinking. In terms of, I think mentors are also very valuable for myriad reasons. They tell you about sort of the opportunities that you would not know about otherwise and would not be accessible to you otherwise. In terms of how to find them, much longer topic, but like things to keep in mind. First of all, they don't have to be just in your demographic group. For example, most of my mentors have been men, although I've had phenomenal female mentors as well. They don't just have to arise through formal mentorship programs. Like maybe you wrote a paper together, maybe you met them at a conference, maybe you sent them an email saying that you liked their paper. I think it's good to reach out if there's someone you admire. Generally, I say no to requests like, can you mentor me? Because of like, I don't know you. That sounds like a big thing. But if it's like, can we chat for half an hour? I'm much more likely to say yes to that request. Pay attention to whether people have reputations as a good mentor. John, for example, does, and that is certainly something I would weight as a PhD student. And let people know that their mentorship matters. I think for sending people an email, like don't just like if you have a mentor who's really nice to you, don't just email them when you want something. Like email them to tell them that you'd like them. Okay. Okay, now I'll go on to the final part of the talk, which is about generating and choosing research ideas, and hopefully this will address a number of questions. Okay, so I would say first, it's okay to not know exactly what you're going to research right now. This is certainly true if you are an early PhD student. It is still true if you are a later stage PhD student. I'm, currently a professor, and I still am kind of like, do I have a coherent vision? So I think it's okay to, feel like you're faking it a bit of the time. I think it's still good to try and come up with like a 2-sentence narrative that you can give to people when you go to conferences. But like, if you don't feel like you exactly know what you're doing, that's extremely normal. My general advice is particularly to early stage researchers is like, if you keep working on things which you're enthusiastic about and which resonate with you, you will do good work and a narrative will tend to emerge. I think also particularly for first stage PhD students, like you don't have to do exactly what you did research on in undergrad. Like, okay, you wrote one paper on computer vision in undergrad. That does not make you a computer vision researcher. You can totally pivot. Very little relative to what you will learn. I think throughout, I have heavily prioritized the stuff that I feel passion or excitement about. I was told by a senior academic recently, and I think this is very good advice. It is very hard to do what we do at a really high level unless you are genuinely excited about it. The reason for this is just that like writing a research paper is incredibly hard. You're trying to push back like the frontier of human knowledge that has existed for literally thousands of years. Like that is not an easy project. And so unless you're sort of willing to sort of I'm not saying work all the time, but unless part of you wants to think about a problem all the time, I think it is considerably harder to push back the state of the art. For example, the guy at the left is Chris Olah, who's sort of one of the world's leading researchers on deep learning interpretability. Deep learning interpretability is an important problem, but I don't work on it basically because after talking to Chris, it is clear that he cares much more about the problem than I do, and I will not be able to compete with him on that. On the other hand, like I love thinking about and writing down Bayesian Bayesian models. Like this is a picture from like, I think a doctor's office at like 7:30 in the morning, and I was bored and I was thinking about a Bayesian model. And so like finding those topics that your brain instinctively jumps to thinking about, the sort of, the problems that your mind instinctively obsesses over, I would take signal from that. Again, I'm certainly not saying work all the time. I'm saying take signal from the stuff you want to think about all the time. I think another related heuristic is, what papers do you like look forward to reading? So for example, I do not instinctively look forward to reading papers. Here are some heuristics. If a paper has no application in the title and it's just like deep learning matrix factorization, then I don't find that interesting. If it's like deep learning matrix factorization for online dating, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. So that's an important signal that I take, that like I'm an applied researcher. Stuff like that. An important caveat to this is like, I'm not saying you have to love what you do all the time. Like, publishing a paper is a pain. There is like a fair bit of annoying grunt work. There is the like, oh, conference A wants citations in this format, and now they have to be in this format, and someone has to do that conversion, and it's generally a PhD student, and that is a pain. So I'm not saying as soon as you are bored with what you're doing for a week, quit. But I do think taking signal from the topics you're attracted to is important. Another heuristic I follow is sort of, you try and find like the quote, point between rage and serenity. This may be less relevant if you're doing pure theory, because hopefully theory is not like enraging you all the time. But for me, I work on a lot of things that are quite upsetting, whether it, be pain or intimate partner violence or stuff like this, and they are genuinely enraging. And so I sort of look for that point where like I'm both angry about the problem, but there is a plausible argument that I have the skills needed to make progress on it. And sort of that point, the point it's both emotionally motivating to you, but also on conscious reflection, you're like, oh yes, we could make headway here mathematically. It's sort of both like a hot-minded and a cold-minded way of looking at the world. Another general piece of advice I have for generating research ideas, just in terms of mindset, is like constantly keeping a curious and skeptical mind and sort of talking to people about your ideas. Like I sort of always go through the world sort of being like, why are things that way? Could we study that? Is that an interesting research question? How could they be better? Here's sort of an example of an email I wrote to a collaborator last year. I was just in the doctor's office, and the doctor basically learned I was a professor halfway through the visit. Like they asked me what I did, and I was like, oh, I'm a professor. And then they started like treating me quite differently. Like they basically went from sort of talking down to me to sort of talking to me in much more technical terms. And I study health disparities, health inequality among other things. And so I was like, oh, could you study that more systematically? Could you document that in the medical record, for example? To give another example of this, at the same visit, I sort of logged into the online interface, and I saw that like they made test results available, like medical test results, whether you have cancer. That links to sort of old deep questions about like, when do people actively solicit information? That links to questions in behavioral econ, stuff like this. And so then I, wrote to a behavioral economist to be like, oh, does this seem interesting? Like, what if you could get the logs from this website of when people are accessing patient information? What might you be able to do there in terms of modeling? I'm not saying any of these ideas are good, by the way. I'm saying you can generate a lot of ideas just by going through the world and sort of thinking about why things are the way they are. And then crucially, you talk to people about whether those ideas are good. You don't then go try and write papers on all of them. Another great source of research ideas and research topics, just reading papers. These are a list of suggestions from Nikhil Garg, who is sort of more mindful and thoughtful about this than I am. Some sources he suggested include, Twitter, if you're sort of intentional about whom you follow. So like, for example, probably don't follow me. I tweet a lot of cat pictures. I'm kidding. You can if you want, but I can't promise to give you good research ideas. Subscribing to relevant mailing lists in your field. You can subscribe to particular people on Google Scholars. So if there's a researcher you like, you can get a notification whenever they write a paper. I didn't know this till recently, and it's pretty handy. If there's like a relevant conference or workshop in your field, you can at least skim the proceedings, look at the paper titles, look at the abstracts. If there's a relevant PhD class, you can skim the syllabus of that. There's also more systematic advice for reading papers, and I'll, provide the slides so you can see these. Pranav, who is a researcher in like biomedical informatics at Harvard, he has advice on sort of how do you read a paper in sort of a systematic way, looking for the gaps. So this is an answer to the question: how do you generate ideas from a particular paper? How do you look beyond what it did to what could be done? And then Mert who's a professor at Cornell, sort of computer vision and stuff like this. He has advice for sort of how do you go from here are the 1,000 papers I could potentially read because you don't have time to do that, to like here are the 100 papers I skimmed, here are the 10 papers I read carefully, here are the 3 I really understand well enough to replicate. And I think both those processes are valuable. I think another general principle to keep in mind is this statement, which isn't entirely true, but is somewhat true, which is that academia is a max function, which is to say, people aren't going to remember every paper you wrote, and they aren't going to super care about like the 17th most important paper you wrote, unless I guess you're really famous, in which case that's a good problem to have. They're going to tend to remember like the most important papers you wrote, which means that like you want to have at least some projects which could be high impact if everything goes well. You don't always want to kind of be trying to bat singles. This is the sports metaphor. Don't always shoot for stuff that is sort of incremental. Occasionally try and do stuff which is high impact. I'm not saying always swing for the fences, like always try and do stuff which is really high risk and high reward, because you may end up with no papers if you do that. But I think having some mix and at least some papers where like if all goes well, it could be really, really cool is a good general principle I try to follow when choosing research ideas. Here's some heuristics I apply when filtering ideas. In general, my problem tends to be that I have like too many ideas and a lot of them are bad. So here are some filters that I apply. First of all, are others excited about the idea? What do I mean by others? This includes technical experts in my own field. So people who like really know the math on this. This would be like core machine learning people. Domain experts. So, because of a lot of my work is applied, I am much more likely to work on a healthcare project if I have a doctor telling me, if you solve this, it will have some impact on patients' lives, because it's very hard just as a computational person to know what problems actually matter in the real world. Like you can't reason from first principles on this one. Lay people, so this includes like, for example, like people like maybe like my sisters who are like super smart, but are not necessarily experts in my field. But like if I can like pitch a medical project to my sister Miriam, who's in law school, like, Miriam has an incredibly fast analytic mind. And that's an indication that like a thoughtful reader of the New York Times or something would find this interesting as well. And I care about that. Are you interested in this idea? Like excited about this idea? Like excited enough about this idea to like work on it for literally thousands of hours? That's an important heuristic. One thing I applied because I have too many ideas is like the 24-hour rule. In other words, are you still excited about this idea 24 hours later? This keeps me from like writing, analysis. Like, for example, if I do the thing that comes to me first, it will be like, let's scrape everyone's drunk tweets on Twitter and analyze that, which is something I have done. It's maybe not the highest impact thing I've ever done. Another thing is like, have you had this idea for a long time? So there are certain ideas that have like stayed with me for years. I've always wanted to pursue them. They've always nagged at me. That's like an indication to me that like those ideas have staying power, at least for me. Another heuristic, what's the ceiling on the idea? That's what I was sort of talking about in the last slide. Like if all goes well, what is this going to be? Is this going to be a paper that 3 people care about, or is it a paper that more than that are going to care about? For me, because I'm an applied researcher, is there a plausible path to real world impact? So stuff like, a hospital saying to me, we want you to work on something so we can potentially deploy it. Probably it's not going to work out, but at least there's like some conceivable thing. If there's a government collaborator, right? We work with like New York City government on various things. Like, are they saying like, we want you to do this thing so that we can, change some aspect of our operations? Industry collaborations can be a path to doing this, right? It's like you're working on an internship on a real feature that could potentially be deployed to real people. That's a very appealing thing to me. It's a good thing to be able to put in a job talk. And then finally, like, why would you do this better than other people? So for example, if you ask me to like design some fancy schmancy machine learning architecture for some modality that I've never used, and like the whole point of the project is to like improve on state of the art, and state of the art is very well established on that task, I don't want to work on that because like I don't know anything about the modality. There's no particular reason to believe that I would do that better than other folks would. Similarly, I try and work on projects that like require a computer scientist. So if like what you can do is like potentially high impact but could be done in Excel, I'm less likely to work on that project because again, there are just a lot of people who can work on that. So sort of some argument for like, why would you do this better than other folks would? Another way to make this argument, at least for applied researchers, is like you have data that no one else does. That's sort of an automatic win in terms of comparative advantage. And again, industry or other collaborations with real world actors can be a great way to get this. General sort of advice regarding pursuing ideas and sort of shooting high. If there's no downside but rejection, do it. This is related to the like academia as a max function point. So like if you're considering whether you should write an op-ed about your work and submit it to the New York Times, or like if you're considering should I submit my paper to Nature or submit it to like less competitive journal, like my advice is generally submit to Nature, submit to the New York Times. Why not? I think a reasonable answer to why not is because it's going to be a lot of work and it's not going to be efficient. That's a reasonable answer. But I strongly urge you to not act on like, because I will feel bad if it gets rejected. Like, get over that. Because basically like, because academia is a max function, it really benefits you to shoot high. A lot of the stuff I've written that ultimately was, published somewhere good was rejected by saying, like plenty of my Washington Post pieces went to the New York Times first, or vice versa. And like, that's fine. No, essays don't come with something that says this was rejected by the New York Times. Papers don't come with that label. And so I think shooting high is good. Final advice for sort of generating and pursuing ideas is, at least consider blogging or writing for a mass audience. I think one downside to doing this is like, it will not on its own get you an academic job. This, I do write a blog. It's called Obsession with Regression. I was once told by a senior academic that this can be the cherry on top of the cake, but you need the cake. I think this is a general attitude among academia. Like ultimately our coin is peer-reviewed papers and you need to write those. However, if you have time to write peer-reviewed papers and also blog or write for a mass audience, I think that can be advantageous for a few reasons. I'll just list them briefly. It forces you to generate your own ideas. So rather than just like taking projects from your advisor is not going to give you blog topics. That's a good thing. It's a lighter weight way to explore new ideas, right? You don't have to write a whole paper on something. You can write 800 words on something. It's more exploratory. It keeps you focused on doing things that might actually interest someone. Like whenever you put something on the internet, you have to ask yourself, would anyone care? That is a useful habit to get into for an academic researcher to ensure that you are not just targeting your stuff to an audience of 2 people. It gives you a space to call your own. So rather than being like author number 3 out of 17 on a paper, where it's like no one really knows what you did, it's very clear that like if you're the sole author on a blog post, you wrote it, and that can be a valuable thing. If you're writing papers where like you're the only author anyway, this is less relevant. But in applied research, you're often not. For me, it was a useful thing to sort of keep me sane. One nice thing about like writing blog posts and stuff like this is that because they're much shorter, it's sort of shorter in terms of time, there's a much more immediate reward. It's not like a paper where like you write it, you do the work, and then like 9 months later, maybe it gets published or something like this. It's a much more immediate thing. It makes you a better writer. Most academics are bad writers. We should all be better writers. I think being a good writer is actually quite valuable in terms of getting people to read your papers and, on the academic job market and so forth. And then I think finally it gets you in the mindset of like, no, like I'm really going to finish this project and I'm going to try and like finish it, in a relatively short time frame. That's valuable because it both gets you better at starting things quickly, like sort of getting as quickly as possible to the minimum viable point on a project, the point at which like I have something here which is concrete and worth pursuing. That's valuable to be able to get to that point quickly in research. It also gets you valuable. It gets you experience at like actually polishing and finishing things, and that kind of discipline I think is also valuable for researchers. So these are all reasons that I think blogging and writing for a mass audience can be useful to your research as well, and is a useful way to generate ideas. Okay, I'm going to stop now and happy to take any questions.